we got a special guest on today, Professor Stephen Smalls. How are you doing? Good to have you here.
Good to talk to you, James. Thanks for the invitation to the show. I know you've had a lot of fascinating people on the show. I've seen some of them before. And, I appreciate that you've invited me, and I hope I can make it interesting for you and for the people listening in.
Definitely, you've got a lot of history. I'm just having a look at your bio now. PhD in your doctorate sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, 1989. Social science from the University of Bristol, England, 1983. Your bachelor BA honours in economics and sociology from the University of Kent, Canterbury, England, 1979. He teaches courses comparative historical sociology of African throughout the diaspora, with particular focus on the United States, the Caribbean, England. He also teaches qualitative methods. His current research prioritizes on political economy of Black order, British imperialism, and its legacy, with special reference to Liverpool. He was visiting professor at the University of Amsterdam also in 2010, 2015. He taught at the University of Massachusetts and Amherst, 1988 to 1992, and in England at the University of Warwick and the University of Leicester also. And also you were teaching in Brazil also, which I thought was very interesting. So you got a lot of history, and we can deal with your timeline. Where did this all begin to get into?
Okay. Well, look, thanks for the overview. I've been very fortunate. I've worked very hard, but I've had great community elders who have supported me. Great. When I was going through school and the schools were hopeless. They had nothing good to say about Black people, nothing good to say about Africans, but Black people in the community, helped me prevent my mind from being colonized. My dad came from Jamaica in the 40s, 1947, before the Windrush. Arrived in Liverpool, was a barber, met my mother, who was white, and I was born and raised in Liverpool 8. When I was about 7, we moved to Egbert Road, and I went to white schools. It was a lot of racism, but I spent all my social life in Liverpool 8, in the 70s, the Unity, the Rodney, the Methodist Youth Club, all that kind of thing, going to discos, the Top Rank and all of that. And what I want to make clear to folks is that I've become very successful professionally, and I'm very, very confident. But I was very hesitant when I was young, very tentative. Some of this was class discrimination. A lot of it was racism, people telling us you can't do it, you're wasting your time, that kind of stuff. But people like Mr. Joey Joel Sr., Jimmy Rogers, Sandra Antigua, Wally Brown, Ewan Gillespie, Carly Montoute, Perry Lee. These were the people that so bit by bit, I managed to get through O-levels, through A-levels, into those universities. So, hard work, family motivation. My father said, listen, don't let anyone tell you you're half caste. You're not half caste. It's nonsense. You're Black. That's right. Get on with it. My mother was the same. Her family, unfortunately, they threw her out. She experienced a lot of racism from their own family. We're not the only ones. I have friends growing up who were like that. So I managed to get to college, to get to university, to study in the places that you've said. And for like many people like me, I wanted to get out of England. I wanted to live in a Black country. I wanted to be around Black people. I wanted to have Black teachers. In all my time in England, O-levels, A-levels, university, I didn't have a Black teacher. I had an Indian teacher, Asian teacher, that was good. I had a couple of white teachers who were very good. Not all of them, but there are people who support. So I went to the US because I was inspired by African-American studies, like so many of us, what we read, the books that we read, and so on. And I was fortunate, to be able to interact with a lot of Black students, to have Black professors. I did my PhD in sociology, but I spent most of my time in the Department of African-American Studies, Black professors, Black students. So that was the motivation, hard work, a lot of encouragement from family. And I had a lot of drive myself. I don't know where it came from. Maybe I was born with it. But that, that's how I got through in those various areas.
Well, you've come a long way. Especially to get over to the United States, and and when you've reached America, when you're over in the States now, what's the difference that you see as far as research when it comes to the research, comparing it to like over in the UK? Like, is it? could you find, because a lot of people believe that a lot of Americans they're not really too clued up on identity and where they're from and those kind of things.
Okay. Well, look, the way I would describe it is a lot of Americans of any color or every color are victims of a highly problematic educational system.
Yeah.
That is narrow, that is chauvinistic, that is nationalistic. It's become a lot more evident now, but it's always been like that. However, Black people, many Black people have always resisted that. So even during slavery, we had Black people in the United States who set up separate reading, even though they risked their lives to do that. We had people who went to church, even though they risked their lives, people with medical knowledge. And once slavery was legally ended in the US in the 1860s, Black people immediately left white churches, the vast majority, because they knew this was not for them. They set up schools, thousands of schools. So I've been tuned into those people, you know, people like Carter G. Woodson, who set up what was first Black History Week, became Black History Month. So a lot of people have had their minds colonized, have had inferior education, but there's a lot of people who have had superior education who are conscious. And many people who don't have formal education, but they have a lot of knowledge that they got from communities. So I've been able to interact with them. I did my PhD at Berkeley. It's very high standard, #1 public university in the world, very demanding. And I spent a lot of time in African-American studies department. So I was able to meet a lot of Black students. The department, the majority of professors when I was a student were Black. When I became a professor in 1995, I've been at Berkeley since then. All my colleagues are Black, women, men, more women than men, some African, some Caribbean, African-American. So I've had that variety that can avoid this simplistic stereotype of African-Americans who are, you know, as I say, are victims. You know, the other thing is that one of the main differences, of course, is in the UK, Black people are only 2 million people. In the United States, there's 46 million. And they've been able to develop institutions, Black colleges that go back more than 150 years, Black literary societies, journals. There's that kind of network.
Well ahead.
They're well ahead compared to the UK.
Definitely. Yeah.
But, you know, they've had that. However, I don't want to exaggerate it. Black Americans still face tremendous obstacles of racism. But because there's so many, and because they've been there so long, you know, in the 1860s, there were already 4 million Black people forced there through slavery, horrific, brutal, sadistic in many instances. But, you know, Black people, they express resilience, resistance, sought ways to express dignity. So I see the Black population as highly varied, and I've been fortunate to move in different sections. The other thing that I'll tell you that's very important is that when I got to the US in '84, only 3 in 100 Black people in the US were foreign, 3 in 100. Now it's 1 in 10. So we've had a lot of immigrants from the Caribbean, from across Africa. So it's become far more diverse in that regard. You asked about the differences. The other thing, of course, is right now in England and in the whole of Europe, there's only 1 Black Studies degree, not even a department, with Kayinde Andrews at Birmingham City. There are hundreds of departments in the United States. And here's another contradiction. So that's a major difference. You can do courses in a wide range of topics. Okay. Another difference, which is contrary to what things look like, because of the right-wing assault and the attack on Black studies, what's going on in the US is when I got there in '84 as a student, there were only about 3 Black studies PhDs. Now there's about 15, James. It's strange, you know, people don't realize that there's an institutional structure. But you know what I also need to make clear? It's far better vis-a-vis England. And it's far more than Black people have had in the US before, but it's not as much as they deserve. There should be far more resources, far more. So when you make that comparison, you know, it's you know, there's better opportunities for interacting with Black people at college.
I'm also interested in when we speak about identity, you know, places like Brazil, for example, Latin America, Africans are also taken to these places. So, I mean, I visited Brazil, you know, I've done a little bit of research, not like yourself, obviously, But how did you find when you were the identity that the Black Brazilians have? And also when we say Black Brazilian, because what I found in Latin America is like, there's a colorism thing sometimes there, where like, it's like what they say, half caste over the
they say mulatto.
Mulatto, yeah.
So we don't like it. We don't like it. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, also as well with them speaking another language, you know, I'm aware of like, say, like people like Sheikh Anta Diop. He was speaking French, and then I'm aware that he had to get his books translated. And about 7 years it took him to get it translated over to the English. Dr. Clark, Dr. John Andrew Clark assisted with that. So to get books into Spanish or Portuguese, I mean, I'm sure if you got some books yourself. You know,
sure. Let me respond. It's a complicated situation, but I've been going to Brazil for 20 years.
Yeah.
And on and off. And I teach on a program over there called the Idea Factory. It's a 2-week program in Salvador in the north of Brazil. And it brings in people from the global south, Black people and others who can't get PhDs, who want to study the ins and outs of race. And, you know, it's a fantastic program. I've written some things. I write in English. They translate it into Spanish and Portuguese and French. I've got some various things like that. You know, the key issue here is working with a team, collaborating with people who speak other languages, who can bring in insights. I've spent a lot of time learning languages. My French and Spanish are very good. My Portuguese is good. And I do projects in the Netherlands. But let me come to Brazil. It's a very complicated situation. And it has to do with the particular ways in which white people try to control Black people. In simple terms, in the US, white people said, no matter what color you are, we regard you as the worst of the worst. There were some differences, okay. In Brazil, and in the US, whites almost always outnumbered Blacks, except in South Carolina. And so they were not as afraid. Okay. In Brazil, Blacks always outnumbered whites, and whites specifically deliberately manipulated divisions along color, along nativity, who was African, encouraging Blacks in Brazil to hate Africans, you know, like they encouraged us here. We grew up with Sambo and Tarzan and Zulu, all that nonsense ran down our throats. Okay. So in Brazil, they have a multicolored system, and therefore the identities are a lot more flexible. And for me, it's a way of learning about how identity is framed in different places.
That's right. Yeah.
They don't call themselves necessarily Black. Listen, the way it's described is Brazil has more people of African descent than any country outside Africa. But they don't all call themselves Black. They don't think of themselves Black. They've been encouraged, and this is centuries of work. So what I do is I seek to work with people who are conscious. You know, people who are, you know, who want to bring Black people forward, who recognize the complexities. And that's why I go in and out of Brazil. There's one other thing I want to say. I'm glad you mentioned these languages. Right now, there are two major issues. There's two issues I want to highlight. Number one is our knowledge of Black America is far greater than our knowledge of any other part of the Americas, right? We know all civil rights, Jim Crow, legal segregation. It's been powerful and inspirational, and it's benefited me. Okay. But there are far more people of African descent outside of the United States, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Venezuela. And that's point number one. Point number two is I'm really encouraging people to move beyond the English language, to look at Black Brazilians who speak Portuguese, to look at Black people in Curacao and Suriname who speak Creole languages, to look at Colombia, because the United States is not representative. It's very important, but more people of African descent speak Portuguese than English. I think there's more Black people that speak Spanish than English. It's a challenge because we're so Anglo-centric. You know, the British education system is so bad. They won't teach us languages. America is so bad. But I think we have more lessons. Let me give you one example. Brazil had rebellions by enslaved people for hundreds of years before the US even existed. So the idea that Black people accepted slavery, when you look at Brazil, it's nonsense. It existed, you know, in the US too. Okay. So, you know, there are these things that because I've been able to travel and meet conscious people, you meet stupid people too, but you're looking for conscious people. I've been able to benefit from those, you know, insights. and forge alliances, forge collaborations. Let me mention one other thing. I was recruited to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, about 15 years ago by a friend and a brother. I would like you to get him on your show. Kwame Namako. He's a retired professor of economics. He's from Ghana, and he recruited me to be involved in efforts to challenge museums and racist Dutch imagery. Kwame set up something called the Black Europe Summer School 15 years ago. And we've had 30 to 40 people from across the US, Canada, from across Europe, who focus on Black people in Europe. But we reject the dominant framework that sees Black people as immigrants. We say we're not immigrants, we're citizens, we're born here, we've been here a long time. We reject the framework that says Black people face inequality because they're not assimilated. It's nonsense. I talk Scouse, people speak Dutch, So this program brings people together, and we learn about the Dutch Caribbean. It was smaller than the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, but not because they wanted it small. They were just as bad, just as wicked, but they couldn't outbeat the Spanish. So again, this comparative experiences gets us thinking about what do we share in common in terms of identity, in terms of resistance, in terms of ideas across the diaspora. So, that's how I've been able to benefit. And I should say, my job is an academic. But people say to me as a compliment, or sometimes people criticize me and say, you're just an academic. I say, look, I was Black before I was an academic. I didn't learn about racism from academia. I learned about it from my family, from kids, calling my mother bad names, calling my father an immigrant. So what I've been able to do, fortunately, is every academic conference I go to, I go out into the community. I reach for people in the community and, make those bridges. So that, again, has helped me, it's helped me keep sane.
Well, that's what it is. It's about connecting with different people around the world, especially conscious people. And we can always get their stories from over here, but it's always important to visit these countries and mix with these local people, and especially the conscious people. And that's knowledge in itself.
That's it. And you know what I say? I say, look, book knowledge is important. Street knowledge is important, but the combination can't be beaten.
That's right.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, because I always like, one thing about identity, it's a funny thing where traveling anywhere, my main focus was trying to travel to all these melanated countries. I travel other countries as well, but the focus was melanated countries. So
me too.
Now, when I went out to the Pacific Islands and listened to their oral history in Fiji about coming from Africa, I was so interested in the African diaspora, sort of like we were talking about. It was totally a bit different when we're talking about Cuba and Brazil and that, obviously brought as enslaved, but they speak on a migration where they left as free people. Now, which is a point in time now, as you're going into your studies now, you learn about the transatlantic slave trade from an academic point of view. Then you're going to come across a lot of knowledge at some point of people like Mansa Musa, the Nile Valley. These were great Black civilizations, Africans, Nubians. So we could go on forever with these. Where did that come into it? Like, as far as like
that wasn't as central for me, direct knowledge and information from Africa. And I'm not exactly sure why. I wish I had spent more time earlier. I've done a lot of reading, but I wish I'd spent more time. One of the most important books that impacted my life in the 1970s, after all the nonsense in schools, one of the most important books was Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And then we learned about Ivan van Sertima. I read that, those books. I read about Sheikh Anta Diop. I read Fanon, and I read who else? By the way, I spent some summers in New York, and I was able to see John Henrik Clark. When he was alive. That was powerful. So it opens up. So reading general histories of Africa, interacting with Nigerians in Liverpool as a kid, asking them what are these cities where that came through. But I focused far more on the diaspora. Okay. However, and I would tell people now, if you're young and you're interested, make sure you get some African knowledge. It's different. We're all Black, but there's different experiences of being Black. And where you grow up, whether it's England, Brazil, Colombia, Portugal, Nigeria, Angola, there's different experiences. Yeah. Okay. But let me tell you about Africa. About 8 years ago, I became very preoccupied with Africa, and I'll tell you why. I came to the conclusion, everyone is talking about reparations for slavery. No one's talking about reparations for imperialism.
Right.
Everyone's talking about reparations for West Indians. No one's talking about reparations for West Africa. It's implicit, it's still, but it all becomes. So I started reading. Yeah, I started reading, what can we learn from Africa after the so-called abolition of slavery? And my argument is that there's tremendous insight from focusing on Africa. And I've been very preoccupied with Africa and very preoccupied with Liverpool. And I'll tell you why. Number one, abolition did not free people, did not free Black people. It didn't free us. They just took the chains off. Number two, they did not give us opportunities for equality. There was no right to vote, nowhere. Number three, they developed new forms of racism, from biological racism to eugenics and so forth. And number four, the English, the British in particular, having been kicked out of the US and lost their major pot of gold, so to speak, they intruded directly into Africa far more. You know, in 1870, Europe controlled 5% of Africa. By 1914, they controlled 95%. It's that stark. And they did it because they developed, the British in particular I'm focused on, and Liverpool, they developed new forms of exploitation, political domination, and social subordination. They focused on Egypt, first of all, because of the Suez Canal, which gave them the path to India, which they exploited more than anywhere else. After Egypt, they focused on Southern Africa. Why? Because of diamonds and gold. West Africa was initially neglected, still exploited, but not as much presence because they didn't think they could get as much profit. However, Liverpool controlled 80 or 90% of trade with West Africa. James, they call it trade. It's a nonsense. It was exploitative economic domination. Okay? And they sought to build, to secure gold, ivory, rubber, palm oil. I said to myself, I used to go to the Igbo and eat food with palm oil. I thought, how did they make a profit? Palm oil was an industrial lubricant for all the machines of the second industrial revolution. So I've started reading over the last 6-7 years, more and more on West Africa, on resistance, on the kinds of, and I say it was slavery in everything but name. Now, some of my colleagues, academics, they love to split hairs. They say it's not. I said, look, to me, it's slavery in everything but name. You can split hairs if you want, call it back. But so that's where I've really been inspired. Yeah. Let me tell you one other thing. I just spent a month in South Africa, and I'm working with a colleague in the Netherlands who wrote a book called Decolonizing the Mind. I'm going to make sure you get a copy of that book in the next day or two. I've got copies. You'll like this book. It's a big book, but you'll like it. A lot of people will like it. So I went to South Africa to get that insights, and we met with people at different universities, Black people. And, it's a very different notion, the experience. It's still, the oppression is there.
Yeah.
Now, what is this saying? It's saying we've only got 9 minutes left. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So what I'm doing, so Africa is important. I wish I had got more earlier. I'm doing the best I can now. I encourage people to get as early as they can. It brings in, a lot more insights. I do want to mention work I'm doing on Liverpool. Jimmy Jagney and I have been talking now for a number of years. We just published a book called 1981, Black Liverpool, Past and Present. Everyone's talking about decolonizing the mind. And I say, and Jimmy agrees, the way to decolonize the mind in simple terms is we need to hear more Black voices, more shows by people like James Diboe, more writings by Black women. And what we've done in that book is brought forward a number of Black people in the past, Charles Wotton, Pastor Daniel Hart, Jimmy wrote a chapter on Liverpool Black Sisters. Let's hear from Black people who were there at the time, who wrote diametrically opposite to what white people say. We can't believe it. These scholars, they're not all bad. They're not all bad, but a lot of them.
That's a question anyway, about the transatlantic slave trade anyway.
Yeah.
From the beginning, and I mean, some people you can start with Henry the Navigator or the Portuguese, and also there's a Moorish connection, which I'm aware of. So what do you find? I mean, I speak to different scholars and that, and then some people, they like to focus on Africans selling Africans, and some just basically focus on they came, you know, imperialism, invaders. So what do you make of the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade to even go where it went to, if you know what I mean?
Well, there's several issues there. Look, they say they were looking for a route to India, and they were. And basically, you know, they call it discovery and settlement. It's nonsense. These are not neutral terms. This is invasion, intrusion, exploitation. Okay. So the start of the slave trade, the transatlantic trade, you know, and Walter Rodney says there were no slaves in Africa. They didn't go to Africa and got slaves. They got Africans and enslaved them later. Okay. Yeah. So I see it as highly motivated, not by discovery, but by a quest for gold and diamonds and to exploit labor.
Yeah.
Okay. The other issue is Africans selling Africans. I think it's a distraction. It's a misrepresentation. And overwhelmingly, when you mention the slave trade, people say, white people say, well, Africans were selling Africans like it's equal. It's not equal at all.
Yeah.
These are processes that were encouraged, exacerbated, Europeans encouraging different ethnic groups to fight against one another. There were real differences. We know that. There were conflicts, there were antagonisms. Okay. But they were exploited, exaggerated way beyond what existed before. So, you know, people say to me, you have to look at that. I say, no, I don't. I don't have to look at your topics. Do you go and look at them? You go and research them. I've got my own priorities. So I have a friend in Amsterdam. She runs something, the Black Heritage Amsterdam Tour, and on the canal. And she says, people say all the time, well, people feel guilty. They want to feel they're not the only ones to blame. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not interested primarily in did Africans sell Africa. I'm interested in why do you raise that topic? You know, it's like reparations. You mentioned the word reparations and people say, we can't do it. We don't know how much it costs. I said, look, let's talk about it before you close the door. We can't calculate. We can't. You know, the British Academy, the European Academy, the Western Academy is supposed to be open, impartial, but they've absolutely refused for decades and generations to talk about reparations. It's opening up now.
Yeah.
Okay. And also they have a simplistic notion of reparations. They think it's just money. It's far bigger than that. So I've been fortunate to interact with conscious people, with knowledgeable people to challenge these. There's one other thing I want to say about Africa, which is this. I argue that Black people left documents and speeches during the period of enslavement. But once slavery was legally abolished in the US, in the Caribbean, in South America, far more Pan-Africanists, far more Black. We have far more writings by people like Marcus Garvey, Amy Garvey, Blyden, Henry Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, all the people don't know because the schools won't tell us. So I see the focus on Africa as producing knowledge. I've read books by Padmore. Padmore says, look, the Europeans say that in Africa to civilize, it's a complete nonsense. We have all the evidence. And I argue that when the scholars say they did civilization, Christianity, they don't give us evidence, but we have evidence of plunder, of prestige. So it's, you know, it's a challenge. And what I think, you know, the things you're doing and the shows you're doing is broadening people's minds, raising consciousness and letting them know, don't accept, or, you know, Fela Kuti has a song, teacher, don't teach me nonsense.
That's right.
And that's what we got in Liverpool. It's
totally right, though. I mean, it's, you know, the first thing, I mean, I'm blessed to say that, well, I've been taught from young, you know, I got the Nigerian in me. So I was instructed and taught, it was constantly mentioned. And then obviously later on, when I decided to start going different African countries, I just got back from South Africa last November, Namibia, you know, interviewing people out there. And it was not like no planned interviews. It was just like people who I was connecting to, who I seen were conscious. And and then I thought to let me hear their side of the story. Now, what was interesting about South Africa, I spoke to someone who was considered a coloured. Well, he called himself a coloured. Back to this identity thing again.
Yes.
He called himself a coloured. And then I've spoke to someone who's just what considered as an African.
Yeah.
So the coloured was basically like I felt like he was complaining about his position, as in they don't know nothing of the economy, like they're treated the lowest. But you see, then I'll speak to the Africans that are mixed, and they'll see a more of a broader picture. They'll see back when during them apartheid time, they'll look back at the history of how some coloureds were all for, like, you know, their own. They were trying to benefit themselves, basically. You know, what did you make out of it when you were there, South Africa?
Yeah, well, I didn't see that in South Africa. You know, most of the people I interacted with were conscious people. Yeah. And there were blacks, there were African, there were so-called coloureds, many of them, and there were also Indians. So like yourself, I'm looking out for conscious people. You know, those people existed. We know that. They existed in the Caribbean. They existed in the United States. So this is one of the legacies that we're dealing with. And we have to work together. But, you know, I'm more interested in working with conscious people. You know, people say, let's get black representation. That's useful, but you know the blacks who were in the Conservative government. You know, it doesn't guarantee anything. Nothing. So I'm interested in what kind of consciousness and what are you contributing to, you know.
That's right.
This so-called coloured complaining, you know, it reminds me of a Bob Marley lyric. Every man thinks that his burden is the heaviest. Yeah. They all think they suffer more than anyone else. And my question is, look, what are we doing now? How are we working together? You know, how do we get ahead? How are we going to be more ahead in a year than we were, you know, last year? So again, as I said at the start, I was very, very hesitant and cautious and nervous as a kid. Unfortunately, because of family, because of community. You know, Wally Brown, you may have heard, has just published a book. It's a fantastic book about his life in Liverpool. He was very supportive, Sandra Antigua. And, you know, and I was lucky that when I was a teenager, reggae came, you know, reggae saved our minds. Like Black American literature saved our minds.
Interesting.
And right now, there's far more material now.
Interesting you said that. Even speak to some Rastas, and where they said, like, from younger, he wasn't aware of the true history, or through listening to Bob Marley and certain other artists, you know, that was like
James
saving,
that was revolutionary.
Amazing.
And I can tell you, even more than that, I knew guys, not mentioning any names, they were illiterate because of school racism. And they learned to read to find out about Haile Selassie and Marcus Garvey and Paul Bogle. Okay. I see the time is running out. One thing I want to say is, look, things have opened up. We don't know how long they're going to stay open. My argument is that things have only opened up because Black people mobilized. And they'll only stay open if Black people continue to mobilize. I have white friends who say, but we help too. I said, look, I understand you help. But Black people have always been at the forefront.
That's right.
I'm going to find a way to get in touch with you. I'll get you this book. Maybe I'll get in touch with Terence, and I'll get you a copy of this book. Let's make sure we're in touch. Let's you and I have another Zoom conversation in the next few weeks. And let's exchange some notes, man. Yeah.
Definitely. You know, thank you very much anyway, Professor.
Yeah. Thanks, James. Yeah, I'm Stephen.